Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first seminar for the fall 2020. Different from what everybody was expecting, but glad that we can somehow carry on with life. So today we have Dr. Salma Mousa, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Immigration Policy Lab and also at the Center for Democracy, Development and the Rule of Law, both at Stanford University. Salma is a political scientist, and she has a very broad experience living and being raised in several countries. And she has been studying social cohesion, both as a concept, a process, and an outcome. Her work has been basically supported by many institutes and has been also widely shared across the media. And today she is going to present the paper that was recently published in Science on social cohesion, intergroup contact, and soccer in post-ISIS Iraq. So Salma will speak first, but obviously depending on how she wants, we'll have the presentation and then the questions, time for questions. She can obviously take the questions. She will be giving the presentation and will, if she wants, or maybe she might not see you, but you can raise your hand for questions. So with that, I'll just leave you to Salma.
Great. First, thank you so much for inviting me. I've been looking forward to this for a while. I'm really excited for the discussion, so I'll try to keep the presentation on the shorter side. Thanks, Ahmed, for inviting me, and Teresa for organizing. And thanks to JPAL and IPA for funding this project. So I'm here to present some results on intergroup contact and social cohesion in post-ISIS Iraq. I should say, if you have clarifying questions, you can write them in the chat, and hopefully one of the organizers will just read them out to me. If not, you can interrupt me if they're clarifying. Otherwise, hopefully we'll have plenty of time for discussion at the end. So let me take you back to the summer of 2014, when a lot of us were horrified to see ISIS take over large swaths of territory in northern Iraq and Syria. That campaign involved the ethnic cleansing of religious minorities, primarily Yazidis, but also smaller numbers of Muslim and Christian groups as well. Hundreds of thousands of whom were forcibly displaced basically overnight from this orange Iraqi area you can see on the left there to the relative safety of the green Kurdish-held area. Many people thought that this displacement would just last for a few days, and it was actually 2 to 3 years before they would return. And when they did return, this is what they found. They found that their churches, their schools, their homes had been all but destroyed. These are two of the biggest churches in the Christian city of Karakush in northern Iraq. You can see the really heavy damage from air raids. ISIS often would just torch things and just burn them on their way out when they were forced out of the city. A lot of bullet holes everywhere. And these pictures are actually pretty recent. Like this place still looks like this, even though the city was liberated 2 years ago. And they also found similar levels of damage to their homes. So on the left is a picture I took in a house in Karakush. You can see in the top left corner there, the AC had been pried off the wall. So all the valuables were gone when they came back, like deeds to their houses, furniture, really anything that could be grabbed was grabbed. And on the floor, you can see the beginnings of a tunnel that had begun to be built by ISIS fighters when they were being closed in on before giving up. And on the right is another home that I visited, also of Christian residents. And in graffiti outside their house, it says, "The Islamic State will live on." And maybe naively, I asked the owners of this house, like, why would you keep this ISIS graffiti outside your house? Like, why don't you paint over that? And they were very adamant that they were not going to paint over it, and they wanted to preserve this graffiti as a testament to the world of what had happened to them. And so this experience is very much ingrained in the Christian psyche and in this communal identity, this kind of collective displacement experience and this collective trauma. And because I think that the people who live in these areas can speak for themselves maybe better than I can describe it, I also have a short clip to show you. And this is Rami, who was actually one of the study participants, and his mom talking about their displacement experience, speaking to a PBS crew who covered the study.
Rami is one of thousands that fled Karakosh as ISIS approached.
تهجرنا كلتنا تاريخ 6/8/2014 فاتوا دواعش على مناطق سهل نينا وكلها طائفية كانت مشتغلة بالعراق حقيقة كان قتل على الهوية.
Rami's mother thought they would only be gone for a few days.
والله شلنا ورحنا اليوم تنرجع وباكر نرجع اليوم نرجع باكر ماكو رجعة عندنا قبل ما هي بس أنا إيش كنت أعمل؟ أمي مريم بس أرجع على البيت أمي مريم بس عندك بس تعاونينا أمي مريم بس تعاونينا أمي مريم قربان اسمتي بس تعاونينا نرجع على البيت.
So I think this shows just a tiny slice of what these people went through, and you can imagine that after this kind of trauma of that ISIS occupation, just occupying your home and just living there, and you come home and that's what you find. And so that displacement experience and that very slow process of return, as you can imagine, has really devastated social cohesion in the area, especially between Christians and Muslims. So the Muslims who stayed behind are seen as being ISIS collaborators, and those who fled, even those who were themselves persecuted because they belonged to Muslim minority groups, they're resented for different reasons. They're seen as encroaching on the Christian identity of these areas and diluting that historically Christian presence. So whichever way you slice it, whether they're seen as ISIS collaborators or even if they are themselves victims, that shared victimhood actually hasn't done much to improve relations. And so this leaves us with a really important policy problem, which is how can we build social cohesion after this kind of violence? And we have a set of tools that potentially can help, which is important given that backsliding into violence after the physical fighting has stopped is common. And so these tools can be categorized as institutional tools and tools at the grassroots level, very broadly. So at the institutional level, you have things like power sharing arrangements, structural protections for minorities. And then at the grassroots level, we have programs that try to improve everyday interactions between individuals. And from those grassroots programs, I'm focusing on one, which is intergroup contact. This idea that positive cooperative contact across group lines generally improves intergroup relations. It's thought to reduce prejudice and build friendships. And on the whole, this is something that's going to take a society forward in terms of social cohesion. So in recent years, we've had a solid causal evidence base growing on this question, but there's still a lot that we don't know. So it seems generally positive, but a lot of open questions remain. From those open questions, we don't know which conditions matter. So what type of contact matters? The original theory says that contact should be cooperative and not competitive, that it should be endorsed by communal authorities and norms, and that it should involve equal power status between participants, at least within the context of the intervention, even if they're unequal in society. And of these conditions, we really only have good causal evidence on one. We also don't really know whether contact can affect real-world behaviors. So there's two problems here. The first is that the vast majority of contact studies rely on self-reported attitudes measured directly after the intervention, and so we don't really know how robust these effects are. And the second is that there is an assumption that's really core to contact theory, which is that if you improve attitudes and tolerance toward the contact partner, so the people who come together for the intervention, these positive effects will extend to members of the outgroup more broadly. So you're now going to navigate the whole world differently. You're going to treat strangers from the outgroup differently, not just the people that you know. And the thinking is that contact is trivial if the effects are concentrated only within the people in the intervention. But this assumption, it seems really key to understand the effectiveness of this tool, and we don't really have systematic tests between effects toward people who meet in the intervention versus more broadly. And lastly, we don't have a lot of evidence for good reasons on contact during or after conflict. For good reasons, because these settings are hard to do work in, but also because the likelihood of negative contact or a contact experience becoming negative is probably higher in these settings. And we do know that negative contact disproportionately shapes prejudice as opposed to positive contact. And so the expectations can go either way here. You could think baseline tolerance is pretty low, so there's a lot of room for improvement. On the other hand, you might also think that prejudice is particularly sticky in these settings, given that we do know that prejudice is sticky among adults, among those who have been exposed to violence, and when the type of prejudice deals with ethnic or religious identities, as opposed to prejudice toward the elderly or the disabled, for example, which is easier to shift. And all of these conditions are true in my particular setting. So what I'm going to do, or what I did do, is hold constant these optimal conditions of contact as much as I can. So this is pretty rough, but generally this should be a positive contact experience via soccer, and team sports naturally meet a lot of the criteria I just mentioned. So it's cooperative, you have this equalizing effect of playing on a team in terms of power status, and the leagues were supported by Christian leaders. And I'm going to hold constant those conditions and then test contact in a post-conflict setting and see whether contact can change real-world behaviors. So can contact build tolerance after war? And if so, do those effects extend outside of the intervention? And so the research question is, can contact build tolerant attitudes and behaviors after war? And to preview the main result, I found that contact improved everyday tolerant behaviors toward peers, so toward the guys within the intervention, but it did not necessarily build broader social cohesion outside of it. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to outline the research design, and then I'm going to dive straight into the main results. I'll discuss a couple of interesting mechanisms, and then touch on potential backlash effects, which are really important in this setting, and show how I ruled those out. And then I want to open it up actually to get us talking in the discussion about trying to understand this pattern of results and the implications. And then I'll end by discussing how much I think the setting generalizes to other settings and takeaways from an academic and policy perspective. So jumping into the research design, so the aim of this study was to build Christian tolerance toward Muslims. If you are familiar with the Middle East, this might seem a little bit backwards, like the broader social challenge is improving Muslim regard toward minorities who tend to be stigmatized and marginalized. The reason why I focus on Christians for this study is twofold. The first is that is just practical. I had access to this community through my NGO partners, and they form the majority in these study sites. And then the second reason is that there are anticipated benefits to building social cohesion within among displaced people. So this seemed like something that was worth doing, and especially given that Christians are the majority in these areas, you still have, in a way, this more traditional dynamic of attitudes toward minorities. So the sample consisted of 42 entirely Christian soccer teams across 2 study sites. And so how this worked was that I partnered with this Iraqi Christian community organization, and we invited all of the teams in the area, which are almost entirely divided by religion. And we invited all the Christian teams in the area to sign up for these leagues. And we really hyped it up, like these leagues are going to be awesome, and the fields are new, and there's going to be bleachers and people in the stands and trophies and professional referees and new uniforms and all of that. And so actually all of the teams who were invited actually accepted the invitation. And so once they were recruited, they then did a baseline survey. And based on their responses to a baseline survey item on empathy toward Muslims, I did a block randomization at the team level. So I took the team's average response to this baseline item on empathy, and then ranked the teams. And then all the 2 closest teams kind of just paired them one after the other, and then did this coin flip to block randomize at the team level in that way. So this is what the treatment actually looked like. So what happens if you randomize the treatment? So on the left, you can see that the control group received additional Christian players, and the treatment group received 4 additional Muslim players. And this holds constant the experience of having new players added to your team. So these are pre-existing teams, and they either get new Christian players or new Muslim players. And these Christian and Muslim players who are added are themselves drawn from the rosters of teams who weren't included at that first step. So they didn't respond to the invitation, or they were like just a little bit outside the geographic area, or they were free agents, or they weren't associated with a team. And so we're holding constant this experience of training with a new player who should be somewhat on your level in terms of skill, because they're already playing and practicing with other teams. And so the randomization happens at 2 levels. The first is your treatment status, which is at the team level, and then conditional on being assigned to receive Christian or Muslim players. Those individuals on your team, they were also randomly assigned. So this left me with 4 leagues of roughly 14 teams each across these 2 study sites. And the teams trained together, and they competed for a 2-month league. And so they would, if you add up these training hours and the playing hours, they met maybe like 2 or 3 times a week for about 2 months. And so it was a league format. So every team played each other. It was like a round robin. And then the teams with the most points then advanced to this knockout stage of playing in the finals.
Sorry, Salma, I just need some clarification. So you just said, okay, so the randomization at the team level is whether or not you get Christian players or Muslim players added. And then you said that conditional on that, the specific individuals are randomized as well. I didn't understand, okay, how that affects the research design, or what kind of inference we can make from that.
It doesn't affect it's more just to have to feel a little bit more comfortable that these guys who are being added to the team, so it's kind of part of the treatment, like who you're actually meeting, that there's no reason to think that like having Muslim players added to your team would mean they were systematically better, for example, than the Christian players. So we get that inference from recruiting those added guys in the same way. So they were from these rosters of teams who weren't included at the first level, and then just randomizing the particular individuals, like it's not really that super important to the research study. It's just to hopefully the distribution of skills would be like somewhat even across the teams. And that is actually what we found when I look at the baseline ratings of the skill as rated by the RAs. Yeah. So who are these guys? So the median player is 23, unemployed, not married, and has a maximum of a high school degree. In terms of intergroup attitudes, they have few to no Muslim friends. They would not be willing to sell land to Muslims, and they would not want to have a Muslim as a neighbor. How do they compare to the general population of displaced Christians? So here I'm comparing the study sample, their baseline responses, with a survey of just over 1,000 displaced Christians, which I supervised in the area around the same time as the first study wave. And so it seems generally, like along these items, like on the left here, you can see, are you proud to be Iraqi? Do you think coexistence is possible? Or do you think Muslims are welcoming? Would you sell land to Muslims? They're pretty similar to the general population. If anything, they're a little bit less tolerant, a bit less likely to want to sell land and view Muslims as being welcoming. So touching back on the research design, so we have this group of guys, they're about to start these leagues. So how do I actually know if this is going to work? And how do I know, more importantly, if the effects of contact will extend off the field? So I categorize my outcomes. First, there's behavioral and there's attitudinal. And within the behavioral outcomes, I look at on the field and off the field behaviors, which is supposed to roughly map onto tolerance toward the guys who you know, and then tolerance toward Muslim strangers outside the intervention. So starting with the on-the-field behaviors, the 3 behaviors I measure: first, how likely are you to register for a mixed team next season? The second is whether you vote for a Muslim player who is not on your team to receive a sportsmanship prize. And this award is really stressed as being about sportsmanship, not about skill. And if anything, it's actually mechanistically biased in favor of choosing a Christian player, because you can't pick someone on your team. And so the guys on the treated teams, there were like 4 Muslims who they couldn't select from. So it was a shorter list of Muslims to pick. And lastly, I look at whether you are training with Muslims 6 months later, after the intervention ended. And those Muslims could be the guys who were assigned to your team, or it could be from the neighborhood in general. The majority who were still training with Muslims 6 months later were training with those who were assigned to their teams. So these are my set of outcomes to reflect kind of this internal tolerance. And moving to off the field tolerance, I capture 3 behaviors that should measure at behaviors toward Muslim strangers and how comfortable you are toward Muslims you don't know outside the intervention. So the first is whether you attend a mixed social event. So this was like a neighborhood event that was put on by the league organizers, and we made it very clear that this was an open invitation to everyone in the neighborhood, and that the Muslim players would be coming, but also other Muslims from the community, and that they could also bring their family and they could bring guests. And so it was very clear that that this reflected the prospect of meeting Muslims who you didn't know necessarily. And actually, in the first study wave, this event coincided with the Ramadan fast-breaking meal, iftar. So it was even more salient for people that Muslims would be coming to this event to eat. And just so if you're curious what this event actually looked like, here's like a little snippet. Those are the guys that don't dance. Those are the guys that dance. So it was a dinner and dancing and traditional dancing and some other like games and prizes were given out. But it was not advertised as a league event. It was advertised as this community event. The second behavior, capturing off the field behaviors, is whether you patronize a Muslim-owned business in a Muslim part of town. So can contact overcome these structural obstacles to social cohesion, things like social segregation? And so what I did was I have these coupons, and you can see a picture here. And so we gave all the players with their unique ID these coupons. And these coupons were valid for a restaurant in Mosul, which is a Muslim-dominated city that's about a 40-minute drive from the study site. And it was valid for 3 months after the league ended. And so we then went and collected these coupons again and then saw who actually showed up because it was stamped with their unique ID. So are you more likely to go to this Muslim town, which was actually seen as the unofficial ISIS capital in Iraq? So it's very much associated, psychologically speaking, with I guess, like Muslim extremism, or generally like not very friendly toward Christians in the minds of the participants. And then lastly, do you donate your $1 survey compensation to the church, or do you donate it to a neutral NGO that serves both Muslims and Christians? So some of the examples given were like orphanages and cancer charities versus the church. And then for attitudes, I have 8 items in the survey, which I measure at baseline and at the end line, which took place about a month after the intervention. And I used this hierarchical clustering model to collapse these 8 items into 3 indices. And so I've labeled these indices national unity. So this consisted of items like we should treat each other as Iraqis first, and ethnic and religious boundaries are arbitrary. The second index I label Muslim blame. So how likely are you to blame these various Muslim civilian groups for Christian suffering? And then lastly, would you want to have any of these Muslim groups as your neighbor? So I'll pause in case anyone has further questions before I dive right into the main results. Okay, so diving straight into the main results. So here I'm showing you the predicted probabilities adjusted, covariate adjusted for the 6 outcomes I just described. So first, comparing the means for treatment and control. So if we look at the on-the-field outcomes first, so training with Muslims, voting for a Muslim to receive a sportsmanship award, and registering for a mixed team next season, we consistently see these significant positive treatment effects. And then when we move to the off-the-field outcomes, so do you visit this Muslim restaurant in another part of town? Do you go to this mixed social event? Do you donate your compensation to a mixed NGO as opposed to the church? There's not much movement there at all. So this suggests that contact seems to be effective for on-the-field or internal tolerance, but it at least seems to struggle in this case to generalize to other social settings. And looking at the attitudinal results, they're not displayed here, but of the 3 indices, I didn't see much movement on Muslim neighbor or Muslim blame, but I did see this positive, pretty chunky effect of the National Unity Index. So there's very abstract ideas about ethnic divisions being arbitrary and the need to treat each other as Iraqis first. But when you ask about really concrete intergroup attitudes questions, like how do you feel about Muslims, we don't really see a change, which again seems to suggest that looking at this generalized treatment of Muslims didn't really move, but the guys who you met in the intervention, that was more malleable. So are these 2 classes of outcomes on the field and off the field? We see here from this pattern, there seems to be a pattern, but can we actually test these against each other? So here's an exploratory analysis that I did trying to answer that question. So what I did here was I estimated 6 new average treatment effects. So first I look at the treatment effect of engaging in at least in 1 on the field behavior, and then the treatment effect for engaging on 1 off the field behavior. And then I test those 2 against each other. And then I do the same for whether you engage in 2 on the field behaviors or 2 off the field, find those 2 ATEs, test those against each other. And then do the same for all 3 behaviors. So once I do that and I'm able to actually directly compare the on the field and off the field behaviors and do this difference in difference. So the 2 difference in difference groups here being first treatment and control, and the second level of difference is on the field versus off the field. There does seem to be this pattern that actually seems to be statistically significant, that contact does actually make you more likely to engage in on the field as opposed to off the field behaviors. So this pattern seems to be like more robust than just that first viewing.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Actually, I have 2 questions on this aspect of the analysis. First of all, I guess I don't fully understand the way you do the on the field, off the field. A more natural procedure would have been, maybe there is some sort of latent factor which represents on the field behavior. You have 6 markers of it, and you do a factor analysis on those, and you do something similar for the other type of behavior. And so I don't fully understand this 1 or 2, and why is that the most efficient way of doing it? The other one is more substantial. So this is a technical suggestion if you want. You can maybe you can improve that. The other one, I don't see what you're measuring with these differences between this is probably my own lack of understanding of these things. But so why is it interesting to look at the differences in these 2 factors, in these 2 latent variables, on the field and off the field?
Yeah, sure. So I think this factor analysis, I think that's also another technique. I'm open to exploring different ways of getting at this question. This is kind of a way that I came up with. I'm sure there are others. What I think works about this approach, so just to maybe elaborate on the motivation. So just going back to the plot for the main results, usually you see a plot where, like, let's say you have a pattern of null results somewhere and then results somewhere else. And we usually just leave it at that. Like we see a pattern here and a pattern here. And so I wanted to take it a step further and test those patterns against each other to understand if they're significant when you test them against each other. And going back to the theory, like, why am I doing this study? One of the core motivations is to know whether contact works just for the people who like these known contacts, or does it actually have the potential to unlock this broader cohesion towards strangers? And so it's good to know that there's a pattern of null results here and it seems more effective here, but to be able to test those 2 things against each other, I think provides more information for getting at that core question of whether effects generalize. I think there's plenty of ways of doing this. I like the idea of doing, well, obviously I like it because I did it. I like the idea of classifying the outcomes in terms of engaging in 1 or more behaviors, 2 or more, just descriptively, like this panel on the left. I think it's interesting to see like the distribution of how many of these outcomes people engaged in. I think another way of doing it would be pairwise, like compare all of the on the field outcomes and all of the off the field outcomes and compare them all against each other without classifying them in this way. I just thought this was kind of a neat structure to understand a little bit descriptively what was going on. So like you can see for all three behaviors, like very few people engage in those. Like it's kind of a sanity check that these magnitudes are going in the same direction as we're kind of asking more of the participants at each step. Yeah, but I think there's other ways of doing it. I think factor analysis would work too.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we seem to see here that contact is effective at least for some behavioral outcomes, more mixed effects for attitudes, and no effects for off the field outcomes or how people are behaving toward Muslim strangers. So why could that be the case? So here are some secondary analyses that I ran, mapping out what does the literature tell us in terms of generating expectations about mechanisms. And so two of the mechanisms that loom really large in the contact literature, the first is that contact might provide more information. And I don't find evidence for that. So the treatment had no effect on information about Muslims. And when you also break apart the treatment effects by subgroup and look at those who had like low versus high baseline information, I also don't see anything happening there. So it doesn't seem to be the key factor in this setting. The second mechanism in the literature is that contact might induce empathy. And similarly, I don't find evidence for this here either. So again, looking at empathy as an outcome, or whether you look at heterogeneous treatment effects by baseline empathy, I also don't see a difference there. I do find some evidence for two other mechanisms, so a mixture of qualitative and quantitative evidence. The first is that having a positive experience seems to be important. So being on a team that ends up being successful seems to be important for amplifying treatment effects. And lastly, it seems to be that contact was changing norms around the acceptability of contact, both among players and among residents. So I'll dive in.
Can I just ask you, does the treatment affect the success of the teams?
I was just waiting for this. I'm like, yes, Alex is going to ask me if team success is post-treatment. Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yes.
Is it post-treatment?
Yeah. So on the one hand, the treatment status doesn't actually correlate with your success. So it doesn't seem like being on mixed teams made you play better. When I also rerun this analysis, looking at when I instrument for team success with baseline skill rating of the players, I also see similar results. But yeah, I think it's kind of in a gray area. I think it is post-treatment in that the actual playing together happened post-treatment, but I think it's kind of part of the bundle. So if you want to,
it's not true that the teams that got 4 extra Christian players scored more goals or won more games,
right?
Or had fewer penalties or whatever.
Yeah, so actually, I don't have it in here, but in the paper, I look at success in 3 ways. So first, like the number of points your team scored. Secondly, the skill rating of the players. And third was the number of goals scored. And actually on all 3 of those, just doing a t-test between treatment and control, there doesn't seem to be a difference. Yeah, so, and actually I'll get into this in a second. So I'll just dive in now to this team success and also these changing norms around contact. So starting first with this changing norms. So it seemed from this observational evidence that at least in the very, very limited, I guess, or the level of just the norms around training with Muslims, like actually playing soccer with people who are not Christian. Like this very basic thing that didn't really used to happen before these leagues seems to have shifted. So here's a quote from one of the Christian players saying, honestly, before this league, you would never see Muslims playing with a Christian team. Like this is the first time. And this is reflected in the baseline data as well. So of the total of 51 teams in the study, only 2 of them at baseline said that they regularly train with Muslims. Another guy said, when the game is over, we hug and kiss even when we lose. That was really a huge thing. So these micro gestures of just being friendly were things that were actually not normalized before we took these steps to actually integrate the teams. And again, because I think the players can describe it better than I can, a short clip of some of the players themselves. The first guy is actually a Christian team captain, and then the other is a Muslim goalkeeper.
عراقية ما فرقنا بين طائفة أو قومية معتقلة، ولكن الأهم الشيء اللي جمعنا هي المحبة. لا موجودة الانفصالات اكثر الكوفيات، يعني نقعد ويا اصدقائنا المسيحيين ونطلع ونرجع. يعني حتى بالاعياد عندي انا اكثر اصدقائي ويانا وياهم بالاعياد، يعني نطلع سوا.
So it seemed, at least among the guys who knew each other and they met, and some friendships grew out of this in ways that would be predicted by the contact hypothesis. And I also have some suggestive evidence of spillover effects among local residents. So here on the left, you can see a picture of a league game. And so these really drew a lot of crowds. This was also in the first wave before we got the funding, like to upgrade the fields. So just don't judge me on the AstroTurf, but a lot of people came out to these, like there were hundreds of people. And so I ran this survey of about 150 local residents, like randomly selected. And we asked them about their exposure to the leagues, which I measured in a few ways. So do you live within walking distance of a field? Did you go to the final game, which had a lot of fanfare and TV crews and a prize ceremony? Do you have a family or friend playing on the teams? And how many games did you attend if you attended games? So these are obviously completely correlational. So maybe more tolerant people actually show up to the games. But there does seem to be some kind of positive correlation between your exposure to the leagues and your intergroup attitudes. So this first plot here, so looking first on the x-axis, if you attended the final game, it seems like the people who attended had a more positive view of the league's impact on their community than those who didn't come to the final. And we invited everyone in the town to show up. And then this was asked actually 3 months after the final. And then the plot on the right just looks at going from the first to the fourth quartile in terms of games attended, and looking at what your likelihood of saying that you support future intergroup programming in the town. So the examples that were given were women's volleyball tournaments and gardening clubs. So again, totally correlational, and but I think it's important that this highlights that spillover effects and these peripheral effects that happen outside of the specific contact intervention are really important if we care about amplifying the impact beyond just the specific people in the intervention, especially since it seems like even among those people, it doesn't necessarily seem to be the case that contact effects generalize. So we're trying to think like engineers, how to amplify the impact of this intervention that only touches a very small number of people. So moving on to team success. So I touched on this earlier, but it really seemed to be important that if you played on a successful team and if the Muslims on your team played well, that this had an impact on how people viewed the entire endeavor. And so I got thinking about this when on the sidelines, like a Christian guy was on the bench and he saw a Muslim player on one of the teams score like a hat trick, and he just turns to the research team or the league staff and he's like, why didn't you give us a Muslim that plays like that? Like instead of, like points like the Christian guy on his team who doesn't play like that. And so these, effects really, I wouldn't say they're contingent on the Muslims on your team not sucking, but it definitely helps to have a similar skill level so that you don't build resentment. And so here I'm just breaking out the effects of playing on a successful team just among the treated group. And this is just a really simple difference in means. So again, looking on the X, 0 and 1 just means are you on a successful team or not? And I'm measuring success by reaching the finals. So did you reach the knockout stage? You were like the best in your league. And then on the Y, I'm showing just the proportion of people on the treated teams who did that outcome. So there seems to be this consistent pattern, even on outcomes that reflect generalized tolerance of playing on a successful team. And this pretty much across the board. When you formalize this a little bit more, like in the covariate adjusted model, you see the same thing. So it seems like the successful teams really did have amplified effects.
Sorry, I think, Salma, you mentioned that you also, this relates to Mushfiq's first question of like, what's going on with that individual random assignment? So this is what's going on with that individual random assignment, right? Is that you're basically getting a random draw of whether you got the good ones or the bad ones. And I guess I'm interested in order to understand this conditioning, so like how much did the skill of the players vary? Like how much worse was the worst set of 4 than the best set of 4?
Yeah. So how I'm trying to get at skill is like looking at the number of goals scored by added players and by the skill rating, like how RAs rate their skill. And there they seem to be balanced, but you still do have individuals that can end up being stars in other ways. Like those two measures are obviously imperfect. So you might have like a really good defender, a really good goalkeeper, and then that wouldn't be measured by in one of those metrics, for example. So I think you do have individual stars, and maybe there's a way to look at people on those extremes rather than just look at the average level of the players who were added. That actually I think is a really good idea. Maybe something like goals conceded as a measure for like defenders, and to look at like the star players and look at where so the top like 3 goal scorers, what teams they were on, or something to get at more of the extreme variation.
So this relates to an important external validity point. Let's hope my internet connection holds up. So in South Africa, traditionally cricket and rugby have been white sports, especially cricket I know well, and whereas soccer has been primarily black sport. And the cricket board has tried hard to integrate more and have more black players come in. And so they've actually had the equivalent of affirmative action in order to get more black players in through the ranks. And that actually created a lot of resentment because they were on average not as good, right? And there was a lot of resentment about white players who were like, we try hard and we try to, we practice a lot and we try to get good, and then we don't make the teams and we don't earn as much money.
That's exactly right. Like people, I mean, I think one of the reasons why this league had so much buy-in and such little dropout is because we made it really competitive and really prestigious and really attractive, and people were really invested in doing well. And so regardless of the religious background, like they want to win. And so the flip side of that is that I think you have to make sure there's some minimum level of skill, or else you will expect backlash effects, and you will expect resentment because you're like a net negative in these people's lives. And so I think it's already, one of the drawbacks as well of using pre-existing teams is that they have this, like, they're much more tight knit. And so when you add a new player, like you already have that risk of resentment at having someone come in who they haven't chosen, when everyone else on their team they're like a tightly run machine, and they've been training each other, they know each other well, and now you're throwing in this random person. So that's one of the drawbacks. Another way to do the study would be to randomly construct the teams. Like you actually put the teams together from scratch, where this might not be as much of an issue potentially. But then you get less buy-in, I think.
Does this correspond to any of Allport's conditions? This like need that your person that you're cooperating with has to be any good at it? Like it seems like a new condition that you're adding to the contact hypothesis, which is like good. We should move past Allport. Yeah. Like we haven't like tested all 4 of the conditions. So is this a 5th one?
I mean, I think his original conditions are reasonable, but I think it's not like, the Bible, or the Quran. Like we can move past it. So I think for any endeavor where like the outcome matters and there's a stake in it and it's something that's skill-based, I think you have to have some minimum amount of skill. Does that map onto like having the experience be positive? I think that's part of it, but it could be something deeper. Like it could be related to like the actual outcome, like success in a more objective sense, rather than just did you have fun doing it? And success doesn't map perfectly onto having fun. Like maybe it's even just to show that a successful experience is possible, like that counters people's stereotypes. Like I think it could reflect a lot of things, but yeah, I mean, if it were up to me, I would add, if it's a skill-based venture, if it's based on meritocracy, you should ensure a minimum level of meritocracy, or else you're going to build resentment. Mushfiq, what do you think?
So yeah, I was wondering, I'm sure you know Matt Lowe's work at UBC much better than I do. So in his experiment was about randomly constructing teams. Is that right? Rather than this?
Yes. Yeah. So I think it's a fantastic study, and I love when we present our work side by side. He actually put the teams together, and I think in that setting you had a lot of buy-in for other reasons. Like I don't need to tell you like how much people like cricket, and he set it up to be like very professional. And so I think in some settings it's possible, and you don't have so much this drawback of less of an investment. But in this setting in particular, I think people just would have there was already this amateur leagues and team structure that was already happening, and it felt a little bit unnatural to move outside of that and ask people to forget about their teams and start from scratch. And it was already a very big ask in this setting to get them to accept having Muslim players on their team. There's a lot of pushback around that. So one of the concessions was like, okay, we keep the teams as they are.
And then finally, Gautam Rao's work, which was in Delhi schools, you know, where that was natural variation, where low caste kids, or I should say low caste, like disadvantaged kids, were put in these classrooms. I would love to, maybe after the talk or like at some point when you have time to write an op-ed, it would be great to get a sense of, like, in a 2-pager, what do we learn from the combination of all these studies, given the differences in like the composition and so forth.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I know that JPAL is asking, like, me and Matt are doing some kind of like evidence roundup about contact, but I think an op-ed is a great idea. Yeah, I love the Rao paper as well, because he does actually look at real world behaviors, and he also looks at academic achievement as an outcome, which I think, like, this all speaks to this other question of how does diversity or intergroup contact affect like success or these like measurable attainment metrics. And I kind of touch on it here, but it's such an important question outside of just the standard prejudice related outcomes. Yeah, that's a great idea. I'm gonna commit myself to doing that.
Okay.
Salma, Stephen had a question on the chat.
Yeah, please.
It wasn't a question. It was just an observation that if you're trying to make the parallel to real societies, then having pre-existing teams is a good thing.
Yeah, it's much more natural.
Yeah.
It's much less artificial that these guys are already playing together, and then you have the drawback of maybe a lack of generalizability or other things, or you can't really tinker in the way that you might want. But yeah, I completely agree. Like, it was as unintrusive as possible.
I mean, if we mentioned just the original contact hypothesis as well. So as I remember, most of the tasks in that were sort of group things, like you all push the truck together rather than individual skills-based things. So that does seem to be a sort of new dimension in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, I'll get to this a little bit at the end in terms of generalizability and how we should update. But one of the key all ports conditions, from the original hypothesis, is that the contact should be cooperative. So it should involve some degree of cooperation as opposed to competition. So if you play against each other, you're not going to find these effects. Which is what Matt Lowe tests very well in his paper. And then the other condition, which I never quite figured out the actual difference, but there's another condition, which is that you should be working toward a common goal. So cooperation and having a common goal are supposed to be like two of the critical conditions.
And thinking about policy implications in other like settings that are consequential, maybe getting refugees and the host communities, right? If they have to do a project together, like, getting them to work together towards like rebuilding efforts, or paying both of them to work in the same team. These might.
Exactly right. I mean, there's nothing unique to contact that suggests that it has to only be this like interreligious prejudice that can be overcome. You can easily apply this to like migrants and refugees, different kinds of refugees, really any cleavage of identity-based difference where that identity is known by everyone in the room. There's no reason why it shouldn't work. And I think that's like the next frontier. And I know you guys have Sandra Rozo is presenting soon, and me and her actually have a project testing a very similar setup in Colombia with Venezuelan migrants. And like, is there something different about having newly mixed populations as opposed to these old neighbors that I have in my setting? That essentially would change our expectations. But yeah, there's really no limits to it, if I may say so myself. Okay, so I know I want to leave some time for discussion, so I'll just dive back in. So I explained a little bit about what happened with the guys on the treated teams, and so now I want to touch on the guys in the control teams. So these were guys on all Christian teams. Can we rule out backlash, or at least large enough backlash to be detected given my sample size? And I want to show that that's the case. I think it's really important in these fragile settings where you have this higher risk of negative contact to be very aware of this possibility. So the first way I rule out backlash is looking at games. This is match level data. So matches that brought together a mixed team with an all Christian team versus matches that brought together 2 Christian teams or 2 mixed teams. And the idea is that we want to rule out that an all Christian team facing off and competing against a mixed team, that they are more aggressive on the field. So then that seems to be the case. There doesn't seem to be a difference in the number of red cards or yellow cards if you're looking at Christian versus mixed team compared to 2 Christian teams or 2 mixed teams, using cards here as some kind of rough proxy for aggression on the field. So like fouls and bad language and that kind of thing. Another way I can rule out backlash is looking just at the control team. So these are the guys on all Christian teams and comparing their attitudes over time. So their baseline and their end line surveys, and there doesn't seem to be much of a change. It looks like kind of a wash. And so this is good. So this suggests that at least they didn't become like significantly more prejudiced over time. I can do the same for the Muslim participants as well. So obviously this is a much smaller sample, so some of this lack of precision is just due to that, but it also seems like there wasn't like a huge increase in their prejudice toward Christians when we look at their end line compared to their baseline.
Was there a coach who was making consequential decisions on the field? Like substitutes and so forth?
Yes.
And was that person typically Christian?
They were always Christian, the coaches, yeah.
Okay. So then why not look at outcomes like the amount of playing time the Muslims were given versus the Christians and things like that?
Yeah, that's a good idea. We actually had in the rules of the league, like when we briefed the coaches, we said that they had to have some kind of equal rotation and that players had to get roughly equal playing time. So we had this like rotating substitute. So these guys were like not in the best shape. So they had to rotate really regularly, and it was like a very high intensity format. So that actually turned out to not be a problem at all. Like we had like unlimited substitutions; they were always rotating. But in general, I think this is a great idea, especially given the importance of like communal leaders and norms and endorsing the contact. The coaches are kind of one of the key figures in all of this to make it happen.
And the fact that performance didn't actually, there was no significant difference in performance is actually, I would say, a positive.
Yeah. Yeah. I lost Mushfiq.
Got lost again.
Oh, you're back.
Okay. Sorry. I was saying that like it might have been a positive outcome.
Yeah. I guess it depends what your expectations are.
Yeah.
Like if the counterfactual is that it would get much worse and like things would just spiral out of control, then yeah, it's good. Yeah. So maybe like a null in this case is a good thing. But the coaches were actually key. Like one thing that we observed was at the beginning when we first integrated the teams, like the Christian players were speaking their native dialect, not Arabic. So they purposely were like excluding the Muslim players. They wouldn't really sit next to them on the bench. Like the players were feeling kind of excluded. And I was telling the research manager, like, are you sure this is okay? Like, I feel bad for these guys. He's like, it's okay. Just let them train. Give them a week to train. We'll do an orientation. And slowly you could see it. They warmed up to each other, but the coaches actually had a key intervention, which is they told their players, this is unprompted from us. They said, we have to all speak Arabic. From now on, we're speaking Arabic so that way everyone can understand what's going on. And that was kind of a turning point for everything else. So I totally agree that like engaging coaches and looking at their decision-making is really consequential. So to wrap up, we have this pattern of results that suggests that contact effects are really concentrated among people who know each other. And so why could that be the case? There's a lot of different structures you could overlay on this result. So here are some potential explanations. One is that it could just be too much of an ask. So it could be like after the kind of trauma that these people have experienced, asking them to then start trusting Muslim strangers is just a step too far. So for example, if you look at this young man in the bottom left corner, he brought this picture to one of the final games of his family member, I believe was his father, who had passed away in the fighting. And this was actually quite common. Like people would bring these framed photos. And then on the right, you see the same guy, like with his Muslim teammate, like joking, laughing, like a few minutes later. And in his mind, there's no disconnect between those two things. Like you can still have the views that you have toward Muslims more broadly and the kind of suffering that you underwent is ingrained in you, but you can meet people and learn to trust them and like them and have friends from that group, and you don't necessarily see that link. And so it might be that these kinds of grassroots programs need those structural policy levers, like things like structural protections and like real policy change to be combined with this grassroots stuff to really unlock the positive effects. Like if he really felt safe going to Mosul and he felt safe going about his day-to-day life, maybe contact would have a bigger effect. Secondly, it might be the case that off-the-field behaviors are actually difficult to compare to the on-the-field behaviors, in that they're more costly. So one advantage of this study is that I'm testing these new set of real-world behaviors, but at the same time, because they're very natural and realistic, the drawback is that they're a little bit less standardized. So it's hard to compare them directly. So for example, going to Mosul is much more of a bigger ask than voting for someone to receive an award. Like going to Mosul requires driving time, getting gas, going through annoying checkpoints and that kind of thing. It might also be that, again, back to my example of this young man, that the guys who you meet in the contact setting, you don't view them as typical for whatever reason. So it kind of is baked into the theory that in order for contact to work and generalize outside the setting, you should see the people who you're dealing with as being typical, or else you're going to do all sorts of mental like self-impretzeling to say that they are exceptions. So if you don't see them as typical, then why would it generalize? You don't see these two groups of people as being the same. So you're not going to make any inferences. And lastly, I find that within, kind of zooming out at all the outcomes I measure, behaviors and attitudes, that the results are more concentrated among behaviors in general. I saw much more weak or mixed effects on attitudes. This actually aligns with other work from post-conflict settings, like in Rwanda and between Christians and Muslims in Nigeria. Also looking at prejudice reduction, and there seems to be this emerging, very tentatively, an emerging pattern that in these difficult settings, it might be actually easier to change or soften some behaviors rather than self-reported attitudes, which might actually be more difficult to shift. Or at least if we're changing attitudes, we're not doing it in a way that we can reliably measure. Like surveys are already too noisy, and it's maybe another reason why we should move toward behaviors. So we've touched a little bit on generalizability. So just to consolidate my thoughts on this, this was a bundled treatment in many ways, and the setting itself was very particular. So what do I think worked well? I think it worked well that this was apolitical. I think it worked well that this was not like a series of dialogue discussions about the conflict itself, and it was something that had absolutely nothing to do with politics or the conflict. That helps us with the first order problem of actually recruiting people to agree to an intergroup intervention. A lot of people are turned off by, like, let's sit around a table and talk it out. Those interventions have their place, and I think they can be powerful, but if you're wanting to optimize for a wide appeal for recruitment, that might not be the best strategy. The flip side is that, I didn't see these changes to attitudes, and in a way it's like, well, why should I expect them to update their political beliefs because they didn't talk about anything political? So that potentially might be a trade-off to consider. The second condition that I think worked well here is that this was endorsed by communal authorities. So this is one of Allport's conditions. And so here you can see in the pictures there that actually a priest was giving out the awards. And on the right is like a rather horrifying team mascot, which I did not sign off on, but he somehow made his way into it. And he's there taking a picture with some members of the Christian armed forces in the area. So these guys would regularly show up at the games. And I think this was really important for, again, in that first stage of getting people to even sign up, for them to know that this was not going to be stigmatizing and that this was fine, and the priests are there and the police are there, and there's no taboo against doing this, given that that taboo existed beforehand, that there was no contact happening when it came to soccer. And we talked about team success. I think success is somewhat of a proxy for a positive experience, but I think it really mattered that in general, like, we made these leagues something that people really cared about and really enjoyed, and listened very closely when they told us how they wanted the leagues to look. And it helps us as researchers, right? People don't drop out, so it's great. And so I think all these conditions can be generalized to other settings, and those include things like classrooms, dorms, military if you have conscription, and workplaces. And there does seem to be this causal evidence coming out on all of these types of settings where they do find positive effects of contact. So lastly, I hope that I've showed you some causal evidence from a difficult setting that cooperative contact can build everyday social cohesion and improve everyday interactions after war. It did seem to improve relations and behaviors between friends and acquaintances and peers who met in the intervention. But I did find that transformative change was more difficult. So those effects did not necessarily extend to strangers. And so taking a step back, if we want, like, we can't do these contact programs everywhere, right? So how can we get the biggest bang for our buck? Two suggestions here. One is to look more at spillover effects. So this analysis I did of the local residents suggests that there's something going on with like being exposed, or there could be something going on with being exposed on the periphery of this contact and seeing it happen, and that being normalized and those effects extending to you. So that's one option. And the other way to amplify the effects of contact could be pairing it with like a deeper level policy tool. So it just might not be enough to focus only at the grassroots level if there are these glaring like structural inequalities that are happening outside of the intervention. Another that I don't have on here is also if you have limited resources, who should you target for this kind of intervention? Obviously these were all guys. There were a lot of particularities about this case that meant that it would have been like very difficult, if not impossible, to have intergroup contact with women. But the upside of that is that it seems, at least anecdotally, that men shape the social norms in this setting, and like they kind of decide what's okay and what's not okay in terms of like what public spaces you can be in and who you can be friends with. And so if you want your bang for your buck, you might want to target the specific individuals who might have more of an influence in that community, and then make sure you get buy-in from the leaders as well. Actually, most of our games happened on church fields, like the fields that were stuck to the churches, and so that was really important. And so if I have one takeaway that I want you to leave this presentation with, it's that contact has a lot of potential, but we really need to start measuring real world behaviors to know what that potential actually looks like. And we shouldn't necessarily take it for granted that these effects will always extend to strangers. And that might be okay in some settings. Maybe in this very fragile setting, you can't expect to build broader social cohesion, and this localized cohesion is enough to actually build resilience against future shocks to tolerance. That's an open question. And so lastly, going back to this like classic literature on social capital, it seems like it might be time to revitalize the promise of these cross-cutting civic organizations, which may actually have been so promising initially because they included this kind of intergroup contact, even though the original framers might not have used that language. And so there's a natural bridge to be built between those literatures. Okay, that's all I have, and I'm really looking forward to your comments and feedback, and I have a bunch of contact and other prejudice reduction experiments in the pipeline, and so this is really the time to have these discussions. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Salma. Some more questions?
Yeah, I have one. So this was super interesting. Thank you very much. So you know, this is a local majority community, the Christians, right, interacting with a local minority, the Muslims, in a state that's historically been ruled by Muslims. And so one question is just about whether you would expect things to work similarly elsewhere with Shia and Sunni, or Muslims and Christians, in areas where the local majorities and minorities were different within even the same state, or whether you would expect things to work very differently. I mean, these may be some of the things you've got in the pipeline, I don't know.
Yeah, so I think the power dynamics here were kind of quirky. I think it's another reason I didn't have it outlined here, but one reason for this pattern of results might also be that Christians are in the national level, in the national context, are persecuted and targeted. And so we do have some contact work that shows that when you're looking at people who belong to minority groups, contact is less effective for them. They're just generally much more skeptical of the whole enterprise, and understandably so. And so that's where you really might need the combination with policy tools to get them on board. In general, it seems to be easier for members of the majority group to reduce their prejudice it makes sense. It's not as consequential to their like existence. You know, it's just kind of like, oh, I met this guy from this group and he was cool. Okay, move on with my life. Like it's not so much of an intergroup threat and anxiety. So I think it just makes the task a bit easier. So I would expect that things would be easier if I focused on Muslims as the dominant group. In terms of other types of cleavages, like ethnic, Kurdish, Arab, for example, or within Muslims, Shia, Sunni, that I don't see any theoretic reason for things to be different for those particular cleavages. But that's something I would love to test out. And I think it's very dependent on the context, who seems to have the upper hand.
So I have another comment more than a question or a suggestion. I think your work is very interesting. I would like to go back for a second to your definition of outcomes and the measurement the impacts that you find. I can see what you're trying to do, I think, and it's good to have those questionnaires. But apart from the fact that, some of your conclusions might be derived, for instance, when you say that there is a stronger impact on behavior rather than attitudes, that could be driven by the fact that behaviors might be easier to measure than attitudes.
Yeah.
And so I would definitely encourage you to explore more effective ways to extract this information from the data, like factor
Actually,
analysis.
can I put this question back to you? Because this is something I've been thinking a lot about. Can we ever definitively answer the question, are behaviors easier to move than attitudes? Given that you can't put them on the same, it's impossible to standardize. A serious question, because it's such
I know. And I've been thinking, well, the second part of my question was going partly in that direction. So one possibility, especially given your context, it should be, I wouldn't say easy, but feasible, is to try to design some alternative measures based on games and interactions among those guys. Actually, one of my ex-colleagues in London has been doing some work in Palestine, where she tried to, she implemented some cooperation games, retaliation games among Palestinians around the wall. And so you could think of, at the end of a football game, to make them play some games that are aimed at measuring cooperation, propensity to retaliation, that kind of attitudes. And those might provide, because they link up directly to behavior and to choices, it might be able to get a more precise handle on attitudes.
Yeah, I actually think that's a good suggestion. Like lab games as being an intermediate step between like real world behaviors and attitudes, like something a little bit in the middle that's more controlled in terms of the measurements. But still, so that's a good idea.
Okay. If you want, I can put you in touch with the person because
please do.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll follow up.
Alex?
Thanks very much for this. I read the paper, but the presentation really just walks me through it. I learned a lot, and I'm really grateful to you for it. I think this presentation this study makes me think about the all ports conditions a little bit differently. And one is this cooperation one. Like you rightly pointed out, you're like, I don't really understand the difference between cooperating and working towards a common goal. Okay, I agree. I can't really put my finger on the difference between that either. We could push on it, but it also, to cooperate, you need another thing, which is the ability to cooperate. Like you can't cooperate with someone who can't play soccer. And so like, it's a funny subcondition of cooperation is the capacity to do that. And I think that may or may not have been present in the previous context studies. Like, all right, you're in a setting where you're supposed to cooperate, but did you have the capacity to even do so? If it's the case that you could only make friends with people who are good at soccer, then we've got a bigger problem than we realized, right? So anyway, I that's one of the places that we're pushing. And the other place that you brought up in the Coexistence is like a weakness of the study, but I don't know that it is a weakness of the study, is to the extent to which the players thought of the Christian players thought of the Muslim players as being typical of Muslims. And like, it's clear that a condition here for changing attitudes is, since the attitude object is the conjured typical Muslim in your mind. So I wonder if in future studies, there's some measurement stuff that you could be doing there. Like, do you think that Muhammad is typical of Muslims in your community, right? And I would have to imagine that they'd say no, right? No, Muhammad's my friend. Are you kidding? Right? Like, but then are there interventions that you could deploy to be like, you know, your teammates are not so different from the Muslims in your community? Like, is there a way to explicitly draw the links to increase this typicality inference that people are doing? It's just a suggestion for future studies.
Oh, this is super interesting. Like, on your first point, I actually think you might be onto something. This ability to cooperate, yeah, you actually might be, because thinking about like some of the studies that find like negative or no results on contact, with all the publication biases we know about, like some are mixed classrooms in the US, like these jigsaw classrooms. And the other is a recent study out of Turkey looking at Turkish and Syrian refugee kids in like a summer camp together. And in both of those cases, in the jigsaw classes, they found that the minority students, like their ability was lower. So, or not their ability, but how they performed in the class was lower than their classmates. And so jigsaw puzzles means you have to all work together to solve something, and then it didn't work. Well, maybe because it's this underlying ability. And the second, like the study in Turkey, like the Syrian refugee kids don't speak much Turkish. And so it seems like ability to cooperate in that sense, like you need to speak a language. Like there are some necessary conditions for cooperation.
Right, the Christian players were willing to switch to Arabic, for crying out loud.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I actually think there's something to that, like the ability to cooperate as being something different from cooperation, which I think is, I want to think about that more. On typicality, that's exactly what I've done in all my stuff in the pipeline now. I'm like, okay, we're adding a typicality question in all of the endline surveys. But more broadly, I wonder, so I have this other study with co-authors about exposure to Mohamed Salah, who is this Egyptian soccer superstar who plays in Liverpool. And in our survey experiment there, among fans of the club, we found that the priming people to really think about the link between Salah and Muslims more generally. So when we remind them, like, he prays, he fasts, his daughter's name is Mecca, his wife wears a headscarf, like that was the only thing that got people to update positively about Muslims more broadly, as opposed to telling them he's successful or he's a really nice guy or these other things. So I think there's something to this, like stressing the link. Having said that, I really struggle whether you view someone as typical, is that actually endogenous to your prejudice? Like if you say, oh, like I have a black friend, but like, oh, they're not like all the others or something like that. Like, but isn't your fencing off of your friend actually endogenous to your prejudice, or is that itself like an outcome that can be changed? Like I'm still working through that conceptually.
Okay. Yeah. So I think this should be for today. If people want to send more questions to Salma, happy to pass them along, and Salma the same.